A happy family's living room, the flower vase was the only witness to the murder.
Part 21 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 21. Mary Blandy, executed for parricide. The unhappy subject of this memoir was a young lady of most respectable family and of superior education, but who, in spite of the exertions of her parents in her early life to implant in her breast sentiments of piety and virtue, was guilty of a crime of the most heinous description, the wilful murder of her father. Mr. Francis Blandy was an attorney residing at Henley-on-Thames, and held the office of town clerk of that place. Possessed of ample means, his house became the scene of much gaiety, and as report gave to his daughter a fortune of no inconsiderable extent, and as, besides, her manners were sprightly and affable, and her appearance engaging, her hand was sought in marriage by many persons whose rank and wealth rendered them fitting to become her partner for life. But among all these visitants, none were received with greater pleasure by Mr. or Mrs. Blandy or their daughter than those who held commissions in the army. This predilection was evidenced in the introduction of the Honourable William Henry Cranston, at that time engaged on the recruiting service for a foot regiment, in which he ranked as captain. Captain Cranston was the son of Lord Cranston, a Scotch peer of ancient family, and through the instrumentality of his uncle, Lord Mark Kerr, he had obtained his commission. In the year 1745 he had married a young lady of good family named Murray, with whom he received an ample fortune, and in the year 1752 he was ordered to England to endeavour to procure his complement of men for his regiment. His bad fortune led him to Henley, and there he formed an intimacy with Miss Blandy. At this time Cranston was 46 years of age, while Miss Blandy was 20 years his junior, and it is somewhat extraordinary that a person of her accomplishments and beauty should have formed a liaison with a man so much older than herself, and who, besides, is represented as having been devoid of all personal attractions. A short acquaintance, it appears, was sufficient to excite the flame of passion in the mind of the gallant captain, as well as of Miss Blandy, and ere long their troth was plighted, that they would be for ever one. The captain, however, felt the importance of forestalling any information which might reach the ears of his new love of the existence of any person who possessed a better right to his affections than she, and he therefore informed her that he was engaged in a disagreeable lawsuit with a young lady in Scotland who had claimed him as her husband, but he assured her that it was a mere affair of gallantry, of which the process of the law would in the course of a very short time relieve him. This disclosure being followed by an offer of marriage, Cranston was referred to Mr. Blandy, and he obtained an easy acquiescence on his part in the wishes expressed by the young lady. At this juncture, an intimation being conveyed to Lord Kerr of the proceedings of his nephew, his lordship took instant steps to apprise Mr. Blandy of the position of Cranston. Prejudice had, however, worked its end as well with the father as the daughter, and the assertion of the intended bridegroom of the falsehood of the allegations made was sufficient to dispel all the fears which the report of Lord Kerr had raised. But although Captain Cranston had thus temporarily freed himself from the effects of the imputation cast upon him, he felt that some steps were necessary to get his first marriage annulled, and at length he wrote to his wife requesting her to disown him for a husband. The substance of this letter was that, having no other way of rising to preferment but in the army, he had but little ground to expect advancement there, while it was known he was encumbered with a wife and family. But could he once pass for a single man, he had not the least doubt of being quickly promoted, which would procure him a sufficiency to maintain her, as well as himself, in a genteeler manner than now he was able to do. All, therefore, adds he, I have to request of you is, that you will transcribe the enclosed copy of a letter, wherein you disown me for a husband, put your maiden name to it, and send it by the post. All the use I shall make of it shall be to procure my advancement, which will necessarily include your own benefit. In full assurance that you will comply with my request, I remain your most affectionate husband. Mrs. Cranston, ill as she had been treated by her husband, and little hope as she had of more generous usage, was, after repeated letters had passed, induced to give up her claim, and at length sent the desired communication. On this, an attempt was made by him to annul the marriage, this letter being produced as evidence, but the artifice being discovered, the suit was dismissed with costs. Mr. Blandy soon obtained intelligence of this circumstance, and convinced now of the falsehood of his intended son-in-law, he conveyed a knowledge of it to his daughter, but she and her mother repelled the insinuations which were thrown out, and declared, in obedience to what they had been told by the gallant captain, that the suit was not yet terminated, for that an appeal to the House of Lords would immediately be made. Soon after this Mrs. Blandy died, and her husband began now to show evident dislike for Captain Cranston's visits, but the latter complained to the daughter of the father's ill treatment, and insinuated that he had a method of conciliating his esteem, and that, when he arrived in Scotland, he would send her some powders proper for the purpose, on which, to prevent suspicion, he would write "powders to clean the Scotch pebbles." Cranston sent her the powders, according to promise, and Mr. Blandy being indisposed on the Sunday night before his death, Susan Gunnell, a maidservant, made him some water gruel, into which Miss Blandy conveyed some of the powder, and gave it to her father, and repeating this draught on the following day, he was tormented with the most violent pains in his bowels. The disorder, which had commenced with symptoms of so dangerous a character, soon increased, and the greatest alarm was felt by the medical attendants of the old gentleman that death alone would terminate his sufferings. Every effort was made by which it was hoped that his life could be saved, but at length, when all possibility of his recovery was past, his wretched daughter rushed into his presence, and, in an agony of tears and lamentations, confessed that she was the author of his sufferings, and of his inevitable death. Urged to account for her conduct, which to her father appeared inexplicable, she denied, with the loudest asseverations, all guilty intention. She repeated the tale of her love, and of the insidious arts employed by Cranston, but asserted that she was unaware of the deadly nature of the powders, and that her sole object in administering them was to procure her father's affection for her lover. Death soon terminated the accumulated misery of the wretched parent, and the daughter had scarcely witnessed his demise ere she became an inmate of a jail. At the ensuing assizes at Oxford, Miss Blandy was indicted for the wilful murder of her father, and was immediately found guilty upon the confession which she had made. She addressed the jury at great length, repeating the story which she had before related, but all was of no avail, and sentence of death was passed. After conviction, the wretched young woman behaved with the utmost decency and penitence. She spent the night before her execution in devotion, and at 9 in the morning of the 6th of April, 1752, she left her apartment to be conducted to the scaffold, habited in a black bombasine dress, her arms being bound with black ribbons. On her ascending the gallows, she begged that she might not be hanged high, for the sake of decency, and on her being desired to go a little higher, expressed her fear that she should fall. The rope being put round her neck, she pulled her handkerchief over her face, and was turned off on holding out a book of devotions which she had been reading. The crowd of spectators assembled on this occasion was immense, and when she had hung the usual time, she was cut down, and the body being put into a hearse, was conveyed to Henley, and interred with her parents at 1 o'clock on the following morning. It will be proper now to return to Cranston, who was the original contriver of this horrid murder. Having heard of Miss Blandy's commitment to Oxford jail, he concealed himself some time in Scotland, and then escaped to Boulogne in France. Meeting there with Mrs. Ross, who was distantly related to his family, he acquainted her with his situation and begged her protection, on which she advised him to change his name for her maiden name of Dunbar. Some officers in the French service, who were related to his wife, hearing of his concealment, vowed revenge, if they should meet with him, for his cruelty to the unhappy woman, on which he fled to Paris, from whence he went to Ferns, a town in Flanders, where Mrs. Ross had provided a lodging for his reception. He had not been long at Ferns when he was seized with a severe fit of illness, which brought him to a degree of reflection to which he had been long a stranger. At length he sent for a father belonging to an adjacent convent, and received absolution from his hands on declaring himself a convert to the Romish faith. Cranston died on the 30th of November, 1752, and the fraternity of monks and friars looked on his conversion as an object of such importance that solemn mass was sung on the occasion, and the body was followed to the grave not only by the ecclesiastics but by the magistrates of the town. John McAnally and Luke Morgan, executed for burglary. These men were of that class who usually visit England during harvest from the sister kingdom, and who, if they possessed honesty, would prove most useful to the community of this country. It appears that in the year 1751, Mr. Porter, a farmer of great respectability, residing in Cheshire, had engaged a number of Irish people to assist in gathering his harvest, when on one evening of the month of August he was alarmed, while sitting at supper, by hearing that they had attacked his house. Every effort was employed by him and his family to oppose the entry of their assailants, but their power being small, in the course of a few minutes the doors were burst in, and they found themselves surrounded by a gang whose ferocious demands for money or blood convinced them of the uselessness of resistance. Mr. Porter, however, for a while delayed meeting the demands which were made upon him, in the hope that some assistance might arrive, but his ruffian assailants bound him with cords, and threatened instant destruction if his money and plate were not instantly brought forth. Miss Porter at this moment made her appearance, supplicating for the life of her parent, when she in turn was seized and bound, and was compelled to discover the chest in which the valuables were kept. In the confusion created by these proceedings, the youngest daughter, a girl of 13, whose presence of mind and courage were alike admirable, made her escape, and determined to procure some assistance to repel the attack which had been made, and running into the stable, she got astride the bare back of a horse, with the halter only in its mouth, and galloping over hedges and ditches, so as to avoid the house, from which she might be seen by the villains, she rode to Pulford, a village at a short distance, to inform her eldest brother of the danger to which their relations at the farm were exposed. Young Porter, with a friend named Craven, whose conduct certainly was the very opposite of his name, immediately resolved upon attacking the villains in turn, and with the girl set off at full speed to render such aid as lay in their power. On their reaching the farm, they discovered a fellow on the watch, whom they instantly killed with so little noise as to create no alarm, and then proceeding to the parlour, they found 4 others in the very act of placing old Mr. Porter on the fire, having deprived him of his clothes, in order to extort from him a confession of the depository of his money, his daughter being on her knees at their side praying for his life. The appearance of 2 strangers was sufficient to induce the villains at once to desist from their horrid purpose, and being now violently attacked, they were compelled to use their utmost exertions to defend themselves. A desperate conflict took place, but one of the robbers being felled senseless to the ground, and the others wounded and deprived of their arms, they jumped through the window and ran off. They were instantly pursued by the young men, and the alarm having by this time been given, McAnally and Morgan were secured on Chester Bridge, having a silver tankard in their possession which they had stolen from Mr. Porter's house. A fellow named Stanley, who turned out to be ringleader in this desperate attack, was subsequently apprehended on board a vessel bound for the West Indies at Liverpool, and with McAnally, Morgan, and a youth named Boyd, who had been left in the house, was committed to Chester jail for trial. They were indicted at the ensuing assizes held in March 1752, and after a long investigation were found guilty and sentenced to death. But Boyd, in whose case some mitigating circumstances were proved, was respited, and his punishment eventually commuted to transportation for life. On the night before the execution, Stanley slipped his irons and got clear off from the jail, not without some suspicion that his escape was connived at by the keeper. On the 25th of May 1752, McAnally and Morgan were brought out of prison in order to be hanged. Their behaviour was as decent as could be expected from persons of their station. They both declared that Stanley, who escaped, was the sole contriver of the robbery. They died in the Catholic faith, and were attended by a priest of that persuasion. Elizabeth Jeffreys and John Swan, executed for murder. The case of these offenders is one of the greatest atrocity. It appears that the female was the niece of a gentleman of respectability residing at Walthamstow, who, having acquired an ample fortune, and having no children, adopted his brother's daughter, and made a will in her favour, bequeathing to her nearly his whole estate. The girl, however, returned her uncle's kindness with ingratitude, and having heard him declare that he would alter his will on account of her bad behaviour, She determined to prevent his carrying his design to her detriment into execution by murdering him. She soon discovered her inability to complete this project single-handed, and she gained the assistance of her accomplice in this crime, John Swan, who was in the employment of her uncle, and with whom there is good reason to believe she was on terms of intimacy. They endeavoured to suborn a simple fellow named Matthews to assist them, but although the promise of a large reward at first staggered him, his terrors eventually steeled him against the temptations held out to him. The night of the 3rd of July 1751 was fixed upon for the completion of this villainy, and at the trial, which took place at Chelmsford before Mr. Justice Wright on the 11th of March 1752, the following facts were proved. Matthews, having travelled from Yorkshire, was accidentally met in Epping Forest by Mr. Jeffries, who gave him employment as an assistant to Swan, who was his gardener. After he had been at work only 4 days, he was sent upstairs by Miss Jeffries to wipe a chest of drawers, and she followed him and asked him if he was willing to earn £100. He answered that he was, in an honest way, on which she desired him to go to Swan. He accordingly joined him in the garden, and he offered him £700 to murder their master. He acquiesced, and on his being dismissed 2 days afterwards, Swan gave him half a guinea to buy a brace of pistols, but having spent the money given to him, he was ordered to meet Miss Jeffries and Swan at Walthamstow on the Tuesday following, at 10 o'clock at night, the object being then to carry out their intentions with respect to the murder. When he arrived he found the garden door on the latch, and going into the pantry he hid himself behind a tub till about 11 o'clock, when Swan brought him some cold boiled beef. About 12 Miss Jeffries and Swan came to him, when the latter said, "Now it is time to knock the old miser, my master, on the head." But Matthews relented and said, "I cannot find it in my heart to do it." Miss Jeffries then immediately replied, "You may be damned for a villain, for not performing your promise." And Swan, who was provided with pistols, also loudly abused him, and said he had a mind to blow his brains out for the refusal. Swan then produced a book and insisted that Matthews should swear that he would not discover what had passed, and he did so with this reserve, unless it was to save his own life. Soon after this Matthews heard the report of a pistol. When getting out of the house by the back way, he crossed the ferry and proceeded to Enfield Chase. Immediately afterwards Miss Jeffries appeared at the door of the house, and called out for assistance, and some of the neighbours going in, they found Mr. Jeffries dying, but they failed in discovering anything which would lead to the supposition of any person having quitted the house. Violent suspicions in consequence arose, and Miss Jeffries was taken into custody, but no evidence arising to criminate her, she was discharged, and immediately administered to her uncle's estate, and took possession of his property. Renewed suspicions, however, were raised, and Matthews having been discovered, Jeffries and Swan were apprehended. Upon this testimony a verdict of guilty was returned. After conviction, Elizabeth Jeffries made the following confession: "I, Elizabeth Jeffries, do freely and voluntarily confess that I first enticed and persuaded John Swan and Thomas Matthews to undertake and perpetrate the murder of my deceased uncle, which they both consented to do the first opportunity. That on the 3rd day of July 1751, myself and John Swan, Matthews to my knowledge not being in the house, agreed to kill my said uncle, and accordingly, after the maid was gone to bed, I went into John Swan's room and called him, and we went down together into the kitchen, and having assisted Swan in putting some pewter and other things into a sack, I said I could do no more, and then I went into my room, and afterwards Swan came up, as I believe, and went into my uncle's room and shot him, which done, he came to my door and rapped. Accordingly I went out in my shift, and John Swan opened the door and let me out. That done, I alarmed the neighbourhood, and I do solemnly declare that I do not know that any person was concerned in the murder of my deceased uncle but myself and John Swan, for that Matthews did not come to my uncle's house the day before or night in which the murder was committed, as I know of. Elizabeth Jeffries. Taken and acknowledged March 12th, 1752. Swan for some time expressed great resentment at Miss Jeffries' confession, but when he learned that he was to be hung in chains he began to relent, and seemed at length to behold his crime in its true light of enormity. On the day of the execution, the convicts left the prison at 4 in the morning, Miss Jeffries being placed in a cart and Swan on a sledge. The unfortunate woman repeatedly fainted on her way to the gallows, and having fallen into a fit, had not recovered when she was turned off. The execution took place near the 6 Mile Stone on Epping Forest on the 28th of March 1752, and the body of Miss Jeffries having been delivered to her friends for interment, the gibbet was removed to another part of the forest, where Swan was hung in chains. End of Part 21. Part 22 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 22. Dr. Archibald Cameron, executed for high treason. The Scottish rebellion had been suppressed nearly 8 years, and England had, during that time, enjoyed internal peace, when Dr. Cameron fell a victim to his exertions in the cause of the Pretender. Dr. Cameron was the brother of the chief of the Highland clan of the same name, and it appears that having studied successively at Glasgow, Edinburgh, Paris, and Leyden, he returned to Scotland admirably qualified to practise the profession of medicine to which he had been brought up. Although educated in a manner which rendered him fit to mix in the best society of the day, he took up his residence in the district of Lochaber, where in a short time he was married to a lady of respectable family. Universally esteemed and beloved by his neighbours for his zealous and effectual services in the civilization of the manners of his countrymen, and for his generous conduct in the attendance of the sick poor, he was residing in the bosom of his family when the rebellion of 1745 broke out, which laid waste the country and introduced misery and wretchedness to many a happy home. The chief of the Camerons was a zealous friend to Prince Charles, and although he firmly believed that any attempt at the restoration of the Stuart family to the throne of England must prove abortive, yet being pledged to assist his prince, he generously sacrificed his own feelings, and appeared in arms at the head of nearly 1,200 men. Thus arrayed, he sent for his brother to undertake the medical charge of his troops, but although the doctor urged every argument which could be raised against so rash an undertaking as that which was proposed, he was at length compelled to forego all further resistance, and to attend the army in his professional capacity, although he absolutely refused to accept any commission. Thus circumstanced, Dr. Cameron was remarkable throughout the whole advance and retreat of the rebel army for the humanity and assiduity with which he attended all, whether friend or foe, who required his aid. And when the battle of Culloden put an end to all the hopes of the Pretender, he and his brother escaped to France in a vessel belonging to that kingdom. While in France the doctor was appointed physician to a French regiment, of which his brother obtained the command, but the latter dying about 2 years afterwards, he joined Ogilvy's regiment in Flanders. In the meantime, proceedings had been taken against the rebel leaders in England, many of whom had forfeited their lives to the offended laws of their country, and by an act of attainder passed in the year 1746, for the effectual punishment of persons concerned in the rebellion, the life of Dr. Cameron was declared to be forfeited. In the years 1750 and 1752, subscriptions were entered into in Scotland for the support of those persons who had escaped into foreign countries, and Dr. Cameron, having already more than once visited his native country, finally in the latter year came over to Scotland for the purpose of procuring some permanent relief for himself and his suffering fellow countrymen abroad. Rumours were soon set afloat that he was in Scotland, and a detachment of Lord George Beaufort's regiment was sent in search of him. Being made acquainted with the vicinity of his hiding place, and being unable for a considerable time to discover its exact locality, the soldiers were unable to secure their prisoner, but at length perceiving a little girl, who appeared to be acting as a scout, they followed her until she met a boy, who was evidently employed in a similar capacity, to whom they observed that she whispered something. They directly pursued the boy, but being unable to reach him, they presented their guns, threatening to shoot him if he did not immediately stop. Having then secured his person, they menaced him with instant death if he did not inform them of the hiding place of Dr. Cameron. The boy pointed to the house where he was concealed, and the unfortunate gentleman was directly placed under arrest, and was then immediately sent to Edinburgh, and from thence subsequently to London, where he was placed in confinement in the Tower. Upon his examination before the Privy Council, he denied that he was the person mentioned in the Act of Attainder, but being brought to the bar of the Court of the King's Bench on the 17th of May, he acknowledged that he was the person who had been attainted, on which Lord Chief Justice Lee pronounced sentence in the following terms: "You, Archibald Cameron of Lochiel, in that part of Great Britain called Scotland, must be removed from hence to His Majesty's Prison of the Tower of London, from whence you came, and on Thursday the 7th of June next, your body to be drawn on a sledge to the place of execution, there to be hanged, but not till you are dead, your bowels to be taken out, your body quartered, your head cut off, and fixed at the King's disposal, and the Lord have mercy on your soul." After his commitment to the Tower he begged to see his wife, who was then at Lille, in Flanders, and on her arrival the meeting between them was inexpressibly affecting. The unfortunate lady wept incessantly, and on going to take a final leave of her husband on the morning of execution, she was attacked with fits, which left her only after grief had deprived her of her senses. On the morning of the 7th of June 1753, the unhappy man was carried to Tyburn to be executed. He was dressed in a light-coloured coat, red waistcoat and breeches, and a new bag-wig. He looked much at the spectators in the houses and balconies, as well as those in the street, and bowed to several persons with whom he was acquainted. He was attended at the scaffold by a clergyman of the Church of England, and, before his being turned off, he declared that he was at peace with all men, and that he died firmly hoping for the forgiveness of his sins through the merits of his blessed Redeemer. When his body had hung during 20 minutes it was cut down, and the heart was taken out and burned, but the sentence was not further fulfilled. On the following Sunday his remains were interred in a large vault in the Savoy Chapel. Dr. Cameron, it appears, was the last person who suffered punishment on account of connection with the rebellion of Scotland, and of all those who were concerned in it, probably he least of all deserved the unhappy fate which befell him. The very small and apparently unwilling part which he took in the proceedings should have screened him from condign punishment, more especially at a period when, all appearance of discontent having vanished, no further harm was to be apprehended. Captain John Lancy, executed for burning his ship. Captain Lancy was a native of Bideford in Devonshire, and was respectably connected. At an early age he exhibited a predilection for a seafaring life, and having served his apprenticeship, he was employed as mate of a vessel belonging to Mr. Benson, a rich merchant of Bideford, at that time MP for Barnstaple. Having married a sister of Benson's, Lancy was soon advanced to the command of the vessel, and on his return from a voyage he was surprised at receiving an order from his employer to refit as soon as possible, Mr. Benson saying that he would insure the vessel for twice her value, and that Lancy should destroy her. The latter hesitated at first to assent to this extraordinary proposition, and for a time the suggestion was not again mentioned, but another opportunity being afforded to Benson on his brother-in-law dining with him, he plied him with wine, and having pointed out to him the poverty to which his family might be reduced in case of his refusal, by his being dismissed from employment, the unhappy man at length yielded to his persuasions. A ship was now fitted out and bound for Maryland. Goods to a large amount were shipped on board, but re-landed before the vessel sailed, and a lading of brickbats taken in by way of ballast, and the vessel had not been long at sea before a hole was bored in her side, and a cask of combustible ingredients set on fire, with a view to destroy her. The fire no sooner appeared than the captain called to some convicted transports, then in the hold, to inquire if they had fired the vessel, but this appears to have been only a feint to conceal the real design. The boat being hoisted out, all the crew got safely on shore, and then Lancy repaired immediately to Benson to inform him of what had passed. The latter instantly dispatched him to a proctor, before whom he swore that the ship had accidentally taken fire, and that it was impossible to prevent the consequences which followed. The crime was soon afterwards discovered, however, and Lancy was taken into custody. But, secure in his anticipation of protection from Benson, he did not express much concern at this situation. His employer, in the meantime, was perfectly aware of the consequences which would fall upon him, and fled to avoid them, and his unhappy dupe, being brought to trial, was capitally convicted, and received sentence of death. He subsequently lay in prison for about 4 months, during which time he pursued his devotional exercises with the utmost regularity, and was hanged on the 7th of June, 1754, at Execution Dock, in the 27th year of his age. Nicol Brown, executed for the murder of his wife. This malefactor appears to have suffered for a crime as savagely ferocious as it was deliberate. He was a native of Cramond, near Edinburgh, where he was decently educated and was apprenticed to a butcher, but his taste tending towards a seafaring life, he entered on board a man of war as a sailor, and remained in that situation for 4 years. On his return he married the widow of a respectable butcher, who had left her a decent fortune. Taking to a habit of drinking, he seldom came home sober at night, and his wife, following his example, he used frequently to beat her for copying his own crime. This conduct rendered both parties obnoxious to their acquaintance, and the following revolting anecdote of Brown will incontestably prove the unfeeling brutality of his nature. About a week after the execution of Norman Ross, already mentioned, for murder, Brown had been drinking with some company at Leith, till, in the height of their jollity, they boasted what extravagant actions they could perform. Brown swore that he would cut off a piece of flesh from the leg of the dead man and eat it. His companions, drunk as they were, appeared shocked at the very idea, while Brown, to prove that he was in earnest, procured a ladder which he carried to the gibbet, and cutting off a piece of flesh from the leg of the suspended body of Ross, brought it back, broiled, and ate it. The circumstances of the crime for which he was executed were as follow. After having been drinking at an alehouse in the Canongate, he went home at about 11 at night, in a high degree of intoxication. His wife was also much in liquor, but though equally criminal himself, he was exasperated against her, and struck her so violently that she fell from her chair. The noise of her fall alarmed the neighbours, but as frequent quarrels had happened between them, no immediate notice was taken of the affair. In about 15 minutes the wife was heard to cry out, "Murder! Help! Fire! The rogue is murdering me!" and the neighbours, now apprehending real danger, knocked at the door, but no person being in the house but Brown and his wife, admission was refused. The woman, meantime, was heard to groan most shockingly, and a person looking through the keyhole saw Brown holding his wife to the fire. He was called on to open the door, but he refused to do so, and the candle being extinguished, and the woman still continuing her cries, the door was at length forced open. When the neighbours went in, they beheld her a most shocking spectacle, lying half naked before the fire, and her flesh in part broiled. In the interim Brown had got into bed, pretending to be asleep, and when spoken to appeared ignorant of the transaction. The woman, though so dreadfully burnt, retained her senses, and accused her husband of the murder, and told in what manner it was perpetrated. She survived till the following morning, still continuing in the same tale, and then expired in the utmost agony. The murderer was now seized, and being lodged in the jail of Edinburgh, was brought to trial and capitally convicted. On August 14th, 1754, he was attended to the place of execution at Edinburgh by the Reverend Dr. Brown, but to the last he denied having been guilty of the crime for which he suffered. After execution he was hung in chains, but the body was stolen from the gibbet and thrown into a pond, where being found it was exposed as before. In a few days, however, it was again stolen, and though a reward was offered for its discovery, it was not again found. Edward Morgan, executed for murder. The circumstances which came out on the trial of Edward Morgan at the assizes of Glamorgan were these. According to annual custom, he had been invited by Mr. Rhys Morgan of Llanfabon, his cousin, to spend the Christmas holidays. He had partaken of the first day's festivity, and retired to bed along with a young man, apprentice to Mr. Rhys Morgan. No sooner had he laid his head upon the pillow, to use his own expression, than the devil whispered him to get up and murder the whole family, and he determined to obey. He first made an attempt on the apprentice, his bedfellow, but he struggled so far as to effect his escape, and hid himself. The murderer then provided himself with a knife, which he sharpened on a stone as deliberately as a butcher uses his steel, and thus prepared he softly crept to the bedchamber of his host and hostess, and cut their throats in their sleep. He then proceeded to the bed of their beautiful daughter, with whom the monster had but an hour before been sporting and playing, and with equal expedition, and by the same means, robbed her of life. Not satisfied, however, with these deeds of blood, he seized a firebrand, and proceeded to the barn and outhouses, setting fire to them all, and to complete the sum of his crime, he fired the dwelling-house after plundering it of some articles. The Gloucester Journal, of the year 1757, describes the property consumed by fire on this melancholy occasion to have been the dwelling house, a barn full of corn, a beast house with 12 head of cattle in it. It was at first conjectured that the unfortunate people had perished in the conflagration. Their murdered bodies, it is too true, were consumed to ashes, but the manner of their death was subsequently proved, partly by what the concealed apprentice overheard, but chiefly from the murderer's own confession. Morgan was executed at Glamorgan, April the 6th, 1757. End of Part 22. Part 23 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 23. The Reverend John Grierson and the Reverend Mr. Wilkinson. Transported for unlawfully performing the marriage ceremony. Among the singular customs of our forefathers, arising in a great measure from their indifference to decorum, one of the most remarkable was matrimony, solemnized, we were going to say, but the fittest word would be performed, by the parsons in the Fleet prison, to which reference has already frequently been made. These clerical functionaries were disreputable and dissolute men, mostly prisoners for debt, who, to the great injury of public morals, dared to insult the dignity of their holy profession by marrying in the precincts of the Fleet prison, at a minute's notice, any persons who might present themselves for that purpose. No questions were asked, no stipulations made, except as to the amount of the fee for the service, or the quantity of liquor to be drunk on the occasion. It not unfrequently happened, indeed, that the clergyman, the clerk, the bridegroom, and the bride were drunk at the very time the ceremony was performed. These disgraceful members of the sacred calling had their pliers or barkers, who, if they caught sight of a man and woman walking together along the streets of the neighbourhood, pestered them as the Jew clothesmen in the present day tease the passers-by in Holywell Street, with solicitations, not easily to be shaken off, as to whether they wanted a clergyman to marry them. Mr. Byrne, a gentleman who has recently published a curious work on the Fleet Registers, says he has in his possession an engraving, published about 1747, of a Fleet wedding between a brisk young sailor and landlady's daughter at Redriff. The print, he adds, represents the old Fleet market and prison, with the sailor, landlady, and daughter just stepping from a hackney coach, while two Fleet parsons in canonicals are contending for the job. The following verses are in the margin. Scarce had the coach discharged its trusty fare, but gaping crowds surround the amorous pair. The busy pliers make a mighty stir, and whispering cry, "Do you want the parson, sir? Pray step this way, just to the pen in hand, the doctor's ready there at your command. This way," another cries, "sir, I declare, the true and ancient register is here." The alarmed parsons quickly hear the din, and haste with soothing words to invite them in. In this confusion jostled to and fro, the enamoured couple know not where to go, till, slow advancing from the coach's side, the experienced matron came, an artful guide. She led the way without regarding either, and the first parson spliced them both together. One of the most notorious of these scandalous officials was a man of the name of George Keith, a Scotch minister, who, being in desperate circumstances, set up a marriage office in Mayfair, and subsequently in the Fleet, and carried on the same trade which has since been practised in front of the blacksmith's anvil at Gretna Green. This man's wedding business was so extensive and so scandalous that the Bishop of London found it necessary to excommunicate him. It has been said of this person and his journeyman that one morning, during the Whitsun holidays, they united a greater number of couples than had been married at any 10 churches within the bills of mortality. Keith lived till he was 89 years of age and died in 1735. The Reverend Dr. Gainham, another infamous functionary, was familiarly called the Bishop of Hell. Many of the early Fleet weddings, observes Mr. Byrne, were really performed at the chapel of the Fleet, but as the practice extended, it was found more convenient to have other places within the rules of the Fleet, added to which the warden was forbidden, by Act of Parliament, to suffer them, and thereupon many of the Fleet parsons and tavern keepers in the neighbourhood fitted up a room in their respective lodgings or houses as a chapel. The parsons took the fees, allowing a portion to the pliers, etc., and the tavern keepers, besides sharing in the money paid, derived a profit from the sale of liquors, which the wedding party drank. In some instances the tavern keepers kept a parson on the establishment, at a weekly salary of 20 shillings. Most of the taverns near the Fleet kept their own registers, in which, as well as in their own books, the parsons entered the weddings. Some of these scandalous members of the highest of all professions were in the habit of hanging signs out of their windows with the words "Weddings performed cheap here." Keith, of whom we have already spoken, seems to have been a bare-faced profligate, but there is something exceedingly affecting in the stings of conscience and forlorn compunction of one Walter Wyatt, a Fleet parson, in one of whose pocket books of 1716 are the following secret, as he intended them to be, outpourings of remorse. "Give to every man his due, and learn ye the way of truth. This advice cannot be taken by those that are concerned in ye Fleet marriages, not so much as ye priests can do ye thing, yet it is just and right there, unless he designs to starve, for by lying, bullying, and swearing to extort money from the silly and unwary people, you advance your business, and get ye pelf, which always wastes like snow in sunshiny day. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the marrying in the Fleet is the beginning of eternal woe. If a clerk or plier tells a lie, you must vouch it to be as true as ye gospel, and if disputed, you must affirm with an oath to ye truth of a downright damnable falsehood. Virtuous laudator et algeter." Footnote: on Saturday last a Fleet parson was convicted before Sir Richard Brocas of 43 oaths, on the information of a plier for weddings there, for which a warrant was granted to levy £4 6s on the goods of the said parson, but upon application to his worship he was pleased to remit 1 shilling per oath, upon which the plier swore he would swear no more against any man upon the like occasion, finding he could get nothing by it. Grub Street Journal, 20th of July, 1732. End of footnote. May God forgive me what is past, and give me grace to forsake such a wicked place, where truth and virtue can't take place unless you are resolved to starve. But this very man, whose sense of his own disgrace was so deep and apparently so contrite, was one of the most notorious, active, and money-making of all the Fleet parsons. His practice was chiefly in taverns, and he has been known to earn nearly £60 in less than a month. With such facilities for marriage, and such unprincipled ministers, it may easily be imagined that iniquitous schemes of all sorts were perpetrated under the name of Fleet weddings. The parsons were ready, for a bribe, to make false entries in their registers, to antedate weddings, to give fictitious certificates, and to marry persons who would declare only the initials of their names. Thus, if a spinster or widow in debt desired to cheat her creditors by pretending to have been married before the debt was contracted, she had only to present herself at one of the marriage houses in the Fleet, and, upon payment of a small additional fee to the clergyman, a man could instantly be found on the spot to act as bridegroom for a few shillings, and the worthless chaplain could find a blank place in his register for any year desired, so that there was no difficulty in making the necessary record. They would also, for a consideration, obliterate any given entry. The sham bridegrooms, under different names, were married over and over again, with the full knowledge of the clerical practitioners. If, in other instances, a libertine desired to possess himself of any young and unsuspecting woman who would not yield without being married, nothing was easier than to get the service performed at the Fleet without even the specification of names, so that the poor girl might, with impunity, be shaken off at pleasure. Or, if a parent found it necessary to legitimatise his natural children, a Fleet parson could be procured to give a marriage certificate at any required date. In fact, all manner of people presented themselves for marriage at the unholy dens in the Fleet taverns: runaway sons and daughters of peers, Irish adventurers and foolish rich widows, clodhoppers and ladies from St. Giles, footmen and decayed beauties, soldiers and servant girls, boys in their teens and old women of 70, discarded mistresses given away by their former admirers to pitiable and sordid bridegrooms, night wanderers and intoxicated apprentices, men and women having already wives and husbands, young heiresses conveyed thither by force and compelled in terrorem to be the brides, and common labourers and female paupers dragged by parish officers to the profane altar, stained by the relics of drunken orgies, and reeking with the fumes of liquor and tobacco. Nay, it sometimes happened that the contracting parties would send from houses of vile repute for a Fleet parson, who could readily be found to attend even in such places and under such circumstances, and there unite the couple in matrimony. Of what were called the parish weddings it is impossible to speak in terms of sufficient reprobation. Many of the church wardens and overseers of that day were in the frequent practice of getting up marriages in order to throw their paupers on neighbouring parishes. For example, in the Daily Post of the 4th of July 1741 is the following paragraph: "On Saturday last the church wardens for a certain parish in the city, in order to remove a load from their own shoulders, gave 40 shillings and paid the expense of a Fleet marriage to a miserable blind youth, known by the name of Ambrose Tally, who plays on the violin in Moorfields, in order to make a settlement on the wife and future family in Shoreditch parish. To secure their point they sent a parish officer to see the ceremony performed. One cannot but admire the ungenerous proceeding of this city parish, as well as their unjustifiable abetting and encouraging an irregularity so much and so justly complained of as these Fleet matches. Invited and uninvited were a great number of poor wretches, in order to spend the bride's parish fortune." In the Grub Street Journal for 1735, the following letter, faithfully describing, says Mr. Burn, the treachery and low habits of the Fleet parsons: "Sir, there is a very great evil in this town, and of dangerous consequence to our sex, that has never been suppressed, to the great prejudice and ruin of many hundreds of young people every year, which I beg some of your learned heads to consider of, and consult of proper ways and means to prevent for the future. I mean the ruinous marriages that are practised in the liberty of the Fleet and thereabouts, by a set of drunken swearing parsons, with their myrmidons, that wear black coats and pretend to be clerks and registers to the Fleet. These ministers of wickedness ply about Ludgate Hill, pulling and forcing people to some peddling alehouse or a brandy shop to be married, even on a Sunday, stopping them as they go to church, and almost tearing their clothes off their backs. To confirm the truth of these facts I give you a case or two which lately happened. Since midsummer last a young lady of birth and fortune was deluded and forced from her friends, and by the assistance of a wry-necked swearing parson, married to an atheistical wretch, whose life is a continued practice of all manner of vice and debauchery. And since the ruin of my relation, another lady of my acquaintance had like to have been trepanned in the following manner. This lady had appointed to meet a gentlewoman at the old playhouse in Drury Lane, but extraordinary business prevented her coming. Being alone when the play was done, she bade a boy call a coach for the city. One, dressed like a gentleman, helps her into it, and jumps in after her. "Madam," says he, "this coach was called for me, and since the weather is so bad, and there is no other, I beg leave to bear you company. I am going into the city, and will set you down wherever you please." The lady begged to be excused, but he bade the coachman drive on. Being come to Ludgate Hill, he told her his sister, who waited his coming but 5 doors up the court, would go with her in 2 minutes. He went and returned with his pretended sister, who asked her to step in 1 minute, and she would wait upon her in the coach. Deluded with the assurance of having his sister's company, the poor lady foolishly followed her into the house, when instantly the sister vanished, and a tawny fellow in a black coat and black wig appeared. "Madam, you are come in good time. The doctor was just a-going." "The doctor?" says she, horribly frightened, fearing it was a madhouse. "What has the doctor to do with me?" "To marry you to that gentleman. The doctor has waited for you these 3 hours, and will be paid by you or that gentleman before you go. That gentleman," says she, recovering herself, "is worthy a better fortune than mine," and begged hard to be gone. But Dr. Wryneck swore she should be married, or if she would not, he would still have his fee, and register the marriage from that night. The lady, finding she could not escape without money or a pledge, told them she liked the gentleman so well she would certainly meet him tomorrow night, and gave him a ring as a pledge, which, says she, was my mother's gift on her deathbed, enjoining that if ever I married it should be my wedding ring. By which cunning contrivance she was delivered from the Black Doctor and his tawny crew. Some time after this I went with this lady and her brother in a coach to Ludgate Hill in the daytime to see the manner of their picking up people to be married. As soon as our coach stopped near Fleet Bridge, up comes one of the myrmidons. "Madam," says he, "you want a parson?" "Who are you?" says I. "I am the clerk and register of the Fleet." "Show me the chapel." At which comes a second, desiring me to go along with him. Says he, "That fellow will carry you to a peddling alehouse." Says a third, "Go with me, he wilt carry you to a brandy shop." In the interim comes the doctor. "Madam," says he, "I'll do your job for you presently." "Well, gentlemen," says I, "since you can't agree, and I can't be married quietly, I'll put it off till another time." So drove away. Learned sirs, I wrote this in regard to the honour and safety of my own sex, and if, for our sakes, you will be so good as to publish it, correcting the errors of a woman's pen, you will oblige our whole sex, and none more than, sir, your constant reader and admirer, Virtuous. Such are but a few of the iniquities practised by the ministers of the Fleet. Similar transactions were carried on at the Chapel in Mayfair, the Mint in the Borough, the Savoy, and other places about London, until the public scandal became so great, especially in consequence of the marriage at the Fleet of the Honourable Henry Fox with Georgiana Caroline, eldest daughter of the Duke of Richmond, that at length, not however without much and zealous opposition, a marriage bill was passed, enacting that any person solemnizing matrimony in any other than a church or public chapel, without banns or licence, should, on conviction, be adjudged guilty of felony and be transported for 14 years, and that all such marriages should be void. This act was to take effect from the 25th of March, 1754. Upon the passing of this law, Keith, the parson, who has already been alluded to, published a pamphlet entitled Observations on the Act for Preventing Clandestine Marriages. To this he prefixed his portrait. The following passages are highly characteristic of the man. "Happy is the wooing that is not long a-doing," is an old proverb, and a very true one, but we shall have no occasion for it after the 25th day of March next, when we are commanded to read it backwards, and from that period, fatal indeed to Old England, we must date the declension of the numbers of the inhabitants of England. As I have married many thousands, and consequently have on those occasions seen the humour of the lower class of people, I have often asked the married pair how long they had been acquainted. They would reply, some more, some less, but the generality did not exceed the acquaintance of a week, some only of a day, half a day, etc. Another inconveniency which will rise from this act will be that the expense of being married will be so great that few of the lower class of people can afford. For I have often heard a Fleet parson say that many have come to be married when they have but had half a crown in their pockets and sixpence to buy a pot of beer, and for which they have pawned some of their clothes. I remember once on a time I was at a public house at Radcliffe, which was then full of sailors and their girls. There was fiddling, piping, jigging, and eating. At length one of the tars starts up and says, "Damn ye, Jack, I'll be married just now. I will have my partner, and—" The joke took, and in less than 2 hours 10 couple set out for the Fleet. I stayed their return. They returned in coaches, 5 women in each coach, the tars, some running before, others riding on the coach box, and others behind. The cavalcade being over, the couples went up into an upper room, where they concluded the evening with great jollity. The next time I went that way, I called on my landlord, and asked him concerning this marriage adventure. He at first stared at me, but recollecting, he said, those things were so frequent that he hardly took any notice of them. For, added he, it is a common thing, when a fleet comes in, to have 200 or 300 marriages in a week's time among the sailors. He humorously concludes, if the present act in the form it now stands should, which I am sure is impossible, be of service to my country, I shall then have the satisfaction of having been the occasion of it, because the compilers thereof have done it with a pure design of suppressing my chapel, which makes me the most celebrated man in this kingdom, though not the greatest. The passing of the Marriage Act put a stop to marriages at Mayfair, but the day before the Act came into operation, Lady Day, 1754, 61 couple were married there. Footnote: in a letter to George Montague, Esquire, from Horace Walpole, is the following notice of Keith. Strawberry Hill, 11th June, 1753. I shall only tell you a bon mot of Keith's, the marriage broker, and conclude. God damn the bishops, said he. I beg Miss Montague's pardon. So they will hinder my marrying. Well, let 'em, but I'll be revenged. I'll buy 2 or 3 acres of ground, and by God I'll underbury them all. End of footnote. It would exceed the limits of this brief sketch were we to give the official history of the different scandalous ministers who thus disgraced themselves and impiously trifled with one of our most sacred institutions. That some of these wretched adventurers were merely pretend clergymen is certain, but it cannot be denied that many of them were actually in holy orders. Of this latter class were Grierson and Wilkinson, the subjects of our present notice, and notwithstanding the heavy penalties imposed by the statute, they were not to be deterred from continuing the dangerous and unlawful traffic in which they had been engaged. Wilkinson, who was the brother of a celebrated comedian of the day, it would appear was the owner of a chapel in the Savoy, and Grierson was his assistant, and their proceedings having at length become too notorious to be passed over, proceedings were instituted against them. Grierson was first apprehended, and his employer sought safety in flight, but supposing that he could not be deemed guilty of any offence, as he had not actually performed the marriage ceremony, a duty which he left to his journeyman, he returned to his former haunts. It was not long before he was secured, however, and having been convicted with Grierson, they were shipped off as convicts together to the colonies in the year 1757. End of Part 23. Part 24 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 24. William Page, executed for highway robbery. William Page was the son of a respectable farmer at Hampton, and being a lad of promising parts, he was sent to London to be educated under the care of his cousin, a haberdasher. His early life, by the superstitious believers of old sayings, would be adduced as proof positive of the truth of the old adage that a man who is born to be hanged will never be drowned. And although we cannot put much faith generally in such notions, we cannot help in this instance pointing out some peculiarities in the adventures of our hero, which might have been considered by him as a sufficient indication of his fate. The early chronicler of his life says that, during the hard frost in the winter of 1739, Page was sliding with other boys on the canal at St. James's Park when the ice broke under him and he sank, and the ice immediately closing over him, he must have perished. But just at this juncture the ice again broke with another boy near him, and Page arose precisely at the vacancy made by the latter, and was saved, although his companion was drowned. The second instance of the intervention of his good fortune occurred in the summer following this singular escape. Page was then trying to swim with corks in the Thames, when they slipped from under his arms, and he sank, but a waterman got him up, and he soon recovered. On the third occasion he was going up the river on a party of pleasure, about 5 years afterwards, with several other young fellows, when the boat overset with them in the Chelsea Reach, and every one in the boat was drowned except Page. But his fourth and last escape from a watery grave was even more miraculous than any of those which preceded it. About 18 months after that which is last related, he was on a voyage to Scotland. The ship in which he sailed foundered in Yarmouth Roads, and most of the people on board perished, but another vessel, observing their distress, sent out a longboat, by the help of which Page and a few others saved their lives. To return, however, to the ordinary events of his life, it appears that his cousin, having given him employment in his shop, his vanity prevented him from bestowing that attention on his business to which it was entitled, and his extravagance being checked by his relation, who stopped his pocket money in order to curb his refined notions, he had, recourse to plunder to supply his necessities. Money being repeatedly missed from the till, and all attempts to discover the thief among the servants having failed, suspicion at length rested on our hero, and his guilt having been distinctly proved, he was dismissed from his situation forthwith. An effort which he made to conciliate his relation after this proved ineffectual, and his father, who had learned the nature of his irregularities, having refused to render him any assistance, he at length journeyed to York, and there joined a company of strolling players. His exertions in his new capacity were not unsuccessful, but at length, attempting to play Cato while in a state of intoxication, his character in the play and his condition of person were found to agree so badly that he was compelled to be carried from the stage, and was dismissed from his engagement. He afterwards went to Scarborough, where his necessities compelled him to accept a situation as livery servant with a gentleman, but his master having been robbed on his way to town, he formed a notion that highway robbery was an easy and profitable mode of living, and determined that, so soon as he should have the means of starting in the profession, he would become a gentleman of the road. Quitting his master at the end of 12 months, he became acquainted with a woman of abandoned character, in conjunction with whom he took lodgings near Charing Cross, and he then commenced highwayman. His first expedition was on the Kentish road, and meeting the Canterbury stage near Shooter's Hill, he robbed the passengers of watches and money to the amount of about £30, and then riding through great part of Kent to take an observation of the crossroads, he returned to London. He now took lodgings near Grosvenor Square, and frequenting billiard tables won a little money, which, added to his former stock, prevented his having to recourse to the highway again for a considerable time. But at length he met with a gambler who was more expert than himself, and stripped him of all his money. He then again sought the road as a means of subsistence. His exertions were for some time fruitless, but at length meeting with a handsome booty, he was emboldened by his success, and taking handsome lodgings he soon gained the friendship of some young men of fashion. His next object was to improve his mind and person, and having gained some knowledge by dint of impudence and through a pleasing exterior, he got introduced into decent society. By this time he had drawn, from his own observation and for his private use, a most curious map of the roads 20 miles round London, and driving in a phaeton and pair, he was not suspected for a highwayman. In his excursions for robbery he used to dress in a laced or embroidered frock, and wear his hair tied behind, but when at a distance from London he would turn into some unfrequented place, and having disguised himself in other clothes, with a grizzle or black wig, and saddled one of his horses, he would ride to the main road and commit a robbery. This done, he hastened back to the carriage, resumed his former dress, and drove to town again. He was frequently cautioned to be on his guard against a highwayman who might meet and rob him. "No, no," said he cannot do it a second time unless he robs me of my coat and shirt, for he has taken all my money already." He had once an escape of a very remarkable kind. Having robbed a gentleman near Putney, some persons came up at the juncture, and pursued him so closely that he was obliged to cross the Thames for his security. In the interim, some haymakers, crossing the field where Page's carriage was left, found and carried off his gay apparel, and the persons who had pursued him, meeting them, charged them with being accomplices in the robbery. A report of this affair being soon spread, Page heard of it, and throwing his clothes into a well, he went back almost naked, claimed the carriage as his own, and declared that the men had stripped him and had thrown him into a ditch. All the parties now went before a justice of the peace, and the maker of the carriage appearing and declaring that it was the property of Mr. Page, the poor haymakers were committed for trial, but obtained their liberty after the next assizes, as Page did not appear to prosecute. After this he made no farther use of the phaeton as a disguise for his robberies, but it served him occasionally on parties of pleasure, which he sometimes took with a girl whom he had then in keeping. Page was passionately fond of play, and his practice this way was occasionally attended with good fortune. One night he went to the masquerade with only 10 guineas, but joining a party at cards, he won above £500, but this money was no sooner in his possession than a lady, most magnificently dressed, made some advances to him, on which he put the most favourable construction. After some conversation, she told him that her mother was a widow who would not admit of his visits, but that possibly he might prevail on her attendant, whose husband was a reputable tradesman, to give them admission to her house. Page, who had repeatedly heard the other address her by the title of my lady, became very importunate with the good woman to grant this favour, and at length, all parties having agreed, the servants were called. Page handed the lady and her attendant into a coach, on which was the coronet of a viscountess. 2 footmen with flambeaux got up behind, and the coachman was ordered to drive home. The home, which they reached, however, was a brothel, and on the lady quitting him in the morning, he found that she had been dexterous enough to rob him of his pocket book and its contents, which no doubt more than compensated her for the favour which she had bestowed upon him. The road and the gaming table were now his only means of support, and he found a fitting companion in his proceedings in the person of an old schoolfellow named Darwell, in conjunction with whom, in the course of 3 years, he committed upwards of 300 robberies. At length, however, their iniquitous proceedings caused an active search to be made for them, and Darwell being apprehended, peached upon his companion and disclosed the places where it was most likely that he would be found. The consequence was that Page was apprehended at the Golden Lion, near Hyde Park, when 3 loaded pistols were found on him, with powder balls, a wig to disguise himself, and the correct map of the roads round London, which we have already mentioned. He was sent to Newgate, and an advertisement inserted in the papers, requesting such persons as had been robbed to attend his re-examination, but he denied all that was alleged against him, and, as he was always disguised when he committed any robbery, no person present could identify his person. He was tried at length on suspicion of robbing Mr. Webb in Belford Lane, but acquitted for want of evidence, and after this he was tried at Hertford, but again acquitted for like reason. From Hertford he was removed to Maidstone Gaol, and being tried at Rochester for robbing Captain Farrington on Blackheath, he was capitally convicted, and received sentence of death. After conviction he acknowledged his guilt, yet exerted himself in the most strenuous manner to procure a pardon. He wrote to a nobleman with this view, and also sent a letter to a gentleman with whom he had lived as a servant, begging his interest that he might be sent to America as a foot soldier, but his endeavours proved fruitless, and he was ordered for execution. This extraordinary malefactor suffered at Maidstone on the 6th of April 1758. Eugene Aram, executed for murder. We are now arrived at that period which brings to our view perhaps the most remarkable trial in our whole calendar. The offender was a man of extraordinary endowments and of high education, and therefore little to be suspected of committing so foul a crime as that proved against him. Much has been written upon the subject of this murder, and attempts have been made even of late years to show the innocence of Aram. The contents of the publications upon the subject would be sufficient of themselves to fill our volumes, and it would be useless to republish arguments which, having had due circulation and due consideration, have failed in their object, which was to convince the world that this offender was the victim of prejudice, and fell an innocent sacrifice to the laws of his country. We shall therefore abstain from giving this case greater space in our calendar than that to which it is entitled, as well on account of the peculiarity of its nature, as of the great interest which its mention has always excited. The peculiarities of the case are twofold: first, the great talents of the offender, and secondly, the extraordinary discovery of the perpetration of the murder, and of the evidence which led to the conviction of the murderer. On the former point, indeed, some seem to have entertained a doubt, for about 30 years after his execution, his name being inserted among the literary characters of the country in the Biographia Britannica, and his high erudition being mentioned, a pamphlet was put forth complaining of this step on the part of the editors of that work, and accusing them of a want of impartiality in affording their need of praise to Aram, and withholding it from Bishop Atherton, who also met with an ignominious death. The charge was, however, answered more ably than it was made, and as it may prove interesting to our readers, we shall subjoin the refutation to the complaint, which appears distinctly to support Aram's right to the character which was originally given to him. It said: "Objections are made to the admission of Eugene Aram to the Biographia Britannica and the exclusion of Bishop Atherton, but it appears to me that the remarks on this subject are far from being just. The insertion of Aram is objected to because he was a man of bad principles, and terminated his life on the gallows, but it should be remembered that it was never understood that in the Biographia Britannica the lives of virtuous men only were to be recorded. In the old edition are the lives of several persons who ended their days by the hands of the executioner. Bonner was not a virtuous man, and yet very properly inserted, as well as Henry Cuff, who was executed at Tyburn in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. As to Eugene Aram, it is truly said of him, in the Biographia Britannica, in the article objected to, that the progress he made in literature, allowing for the little instruction he had received, may justly be considered as astonishing, and that his powers of mind were uncommonly great cannot reasonably be questioned. Eugene Aram possessed talents and acquisitions that might have classed him among the most respectable of human characters, if his moral qualities had been equal to his intellectual. It was certainly the extraordinary talents and acquirements of Eugene Aram which occasioned his introduction into the Biographia, and I know that by persons of undoubted taste and judgment the account of him in that work has been thought a curious and interesting article. His singular defence alone was well worthy of being preserved in such a work. With respect to Bishop Atherton, he never had the least claim to insertion in such a work as the Biographia Britannica, and was therefore very properly omitted in the new edition. He was not in the least distinguished for genius or learning. His merely being a bishop could give him no just pretensions, and still less the unnatural crime for which he suffered. The friends of Bishop Atherton say that his reputation was suspected to have been destroyed, and his catastrophe effected, more by the contrivance of a party than by the aggravated guilt with which he was charged. If this were perfectly just, which, however, may be reasonably questioned, it would not give Bishop Atherton the least claim to insertion in the Biographia Britannica. Aram was inserted on account of his uncommon talents and learning, but Atherton, who was not distinguished for either, never had the least pretension to be recorded in such a work. The talents and abilities of this criminal, therefore, seem to be undoubted, but that a man possessing powers of intellect so great should have been guilty of such a crime as that which he committed seems most extraordinary. Within the second peculiarity of the case will very properly come the narrative of the life of its hero, as well as the circumstances attending the commission of the crime and the discovery of its perpetrator. A succinct description of the case will probably be more intelligible than a detail of all of the exceedingly minute circumstances by which it was surrounded. Eugene Aram was born in the village of Netherdale, in Yorkshire, in the year 1704, of an ancient and highly respectable family, but although it is shown by the chronicles that one of his ancestors served the office of High Sheriff in the reign of Edward III, it appears that at the time of the birth of Eugene the vicissitudes of fortune had so far reduced its rank that his father was compelled to support himself and his children by working as a gardener in the house of Sir Edward Blackett, although in that situation he was well employed and highly respected. In his infancy Aram's parents removed to the village of Shelton, near Newby, in the same county, and when about 6 years old his father, having saved a small sum of money out of his weekly earnings, purchased a small cottage at Bondgate, near Ripon. The first indications of that singular genius, which afterwards displayed itself in so remarkable a manner in our hero, were given while his father was in the service of Sir Edward. Eugene was employed as an attendant upon that gentleman, and he early displayed a taste for literature, which was fostered and supported by his indulgent master. His disposition was solitary, and every leisure hour which presented itself to him was devoted to retirement and study, and in the employment which good fortune had bestowed upon him, ample opportunities were afforded him of following the bent of his inclinations. He applied himself chiefly to mathematics, and at the age of 16 he had acquired a considerable proficiency in them, but his kind and indulgent master dying about this time, he was employed by his brother, Mr. Christopher Blackett, a merchant in London, who took him into his service as bookkeeper. This was an occupation ill suited to his desires, and an attack of the smallpox having rendered his return to Yorkshire necessary, he did not afterwards resume his employment in London, but at the invitation of his father he remained at Newby to pursue his studies. He now found that the study of mathematics possessed but few charms, and the politer subjects of poetry, history, and antiquities next engaged his attention. Every day served to increase the store of knowledge which he possessed, and his fame as a scholar having now extended to his native place, he was invited to take charge of a school there. The means of study and of profit appeared to him to be thus united, and he immediately accepted the offer which was made, and after a short time he married a young woman of the village, to whom he appeared tenderly attached. To this marriage, however, which proved unhappy, he attributed all his subsequent misfortunes, but whether with truth or not, the course of the narrative does not distinctly disclose. His deficiency in the learned languages now struck him, and he immediately set about conquering the difficulties which presented themselves in this new field of research, and so rapid was his progress, that ere a year had passed he was able to read with ease the less difficult of the Latin and Greek historians and poets. In the year 1734, an opportunity was afforded him of adding a knowledge of the Hebrew language to his list of acquirements, for in that year Mr. William Norton of Knaresborough, a gentleman of great talents, who had conceived a strong attachment towards him, invited him to his house, and afforded him the means necessary for pursuing its study. He continued in his situation in Yorkshire until the year 1745, when he again visited London, and accepted an engagement in the school of the Reverend Mr. Plainblanc, in Piccadilly, as usher in Latin and writing, and with this gentleman's assistance he acquired the knowledge of the French language. He was afterwards employed as an usher and tutor in several different parts of England, in the course of which, through his own exertions, he became acquainted with heraldry and botany, and so great was his perseverance that he also learned the Chaldaic and Arabic languages. His next step was to investigate the Celtic in all its dialects, and having begun to form collections and make comparisons between the Celtic, the English, the Latin, the Greek, and the Hebrew, and found a great affinity between them, he resolved to proceed through all those languages and to form a comparative lexicon. But amid these learned labours and inquiries, it appears that he committed a crime which could not naturally have been expected from a man of so studious a turn, as the inducement which led him to it was merely the gain of wealth, of which the scholar is seldom covetous. On the 8th of February in 1745, in conjunction with a man named Richard Houseman, he committed the murder for which his life was afterwards forfeited to the laws of his country. The object of this diabolical crime was Daniel Clark, a shoemaker, living at Knaresborough, and it appears that this unfortunate man, having lately married a woman of a good family, industriously circulated a report that his wife was entitled to a considerable fortune, which he should soon receive. Aram and Houseman, in consequence, conceiving hopes of procuring some advantage from this circumstance, persuaded Clark to make an ostentatious show of his own riches, in order to induce his wife's relations to give him that fortune of which he had boasted. It is not impossible that in giving their subsequent victim this advice, they may at the time have acted from a spirit of friendship, and any intention of committing that crime for which they afterwards received their reward, but the belief that the design was already formed receives equal confirmation from subsequent events. Clark, it seems, was easily induced to comply with a hint so agreeable to his own desires, and he borrowed and bought on credit a large quantity of silver plate, with jewels, watches, rings, etc. He told the persons of whom he purchased that a merchant in London had sent him an order to buy such plate for exportation, and no doubt was entertained of his credit till his sudden disappearance in February 1745, when it was imagined that he had gone abroad, or at least to London, to dispose of his ill-acquired property. Whatever doubt may exist as to the original intention of the parties, their object at this time is perfectly clear, and there can be no hesitation in supposing that Aram and Houseman had at this time determined to murder their dupe, in order to share the booty. On the night of the 8th of February 1745, they persuaded Clark to take a walk with them, in order to consult upon the proper method to dispose of the effects, and engaged in the discussion of this subject they turned into a field, at a small distance from the town, well known by the name of St. Robert's Cave. On arrival there, Aram and Clark went over a hedge towards the cave, and when they had got within 6 or 7 yards of it, Houseman, by the light of the moon, saw Aram strike Clark several times, and at length beheld him fall, but never saw him afterwards. These were the facts immediately connected with the murder, which were proved at the trial by Houseman, who was admitted King's evidence, and whatever were the subsequent proceedings of the parties in respect of the body, they must remain a mystery. The murderers, going home, shared Clark's ill-gotten treasure, the half of which Houseman concealed in his garden for a 12-month, and then took it to Scotland, where he sold it. In the meantime Aram carried his share to London, where he sold it to a Jew, and then returned to his engagement with Mr. Plainblanc in Piccadilly. 14 years afterwards elapsed, and no tidings being received of Aram, it was concluded that he was dead, and these 14 years had also elapsed without any clue being obtained to unravel the mystery of the sudden disappearance of Clark. The time at length came, however, at which all the doubts which existed upon both subjects were to be solved. In the year 1758, a labourer named Jones was employed to dig for stone in St. Robert's Cave, in order to supply a lime kiln at a place called Thistle Hill, near Knaresborough, and having dug about 2 feet deep, he found the bones of a human body, still knit together by the ligaments of the joints. It had evidently been buried double, and there were indications about it which could not but lead to the supposition that some unfair means had been resorted to in order to deprive the living being of life. The incident afforded good grounds for general curiosity being raised, and general inquiry taking place, and hints were soon thrown out that it might be the body of Clark, whose unexpected disappearance was still fresh in the memory of many, and whose continued absence had been the subject of so much surprise. Suggestions of his murder, which had been thrown out by Aram's wife, were called to mind, and a coroner's inquest being held, she was summoned. By this time a general impression prevailed that the remains found were those of Clark, and the testimony of Mrs. Aram greatly confirmed the idea which had gone abroad. She deposed that she believed that Clark had been murdered by Houseman and her husband, and that they had acquired considerable booty for the crime, but she was unable to give any account of her husband, or to state whether he was still in existence or not. Inquiries being made, however, Houseman was soon found, and on his being brought forward to be examined, he exhibited the utmost confusion. The coroner desired that he would take up one of the bones, probably with a view of seeing what effect such a proceeding would produce, and upon his doing so, he showed still further terror, and exclaimed, "This is no more Daniel Clark's bone than it is mine." The suspicions which were already entertained of his guilt were, in a great measure, confirmed by this observation, and it was generally believed that he knew the precise spot where the real remains of the murdered man were deposited, even if he had not been a party to their interment. He was therefore strictly questioned, and after many attempts at evasion, he said that Clark was murdered by Eugene Aram, and that his body was buried in St. Robert's Cave, but that the head lay further to the right in the turn near the entrance of the cavern than the spot where the skeleton produced was found. Search was immediately made, and a skeleton was found, in a situation corresponding exactly with that which had been pointed out. In consequence of this confession, an inquiry was immediately set on foot for Aram, and after a considerable time he was discovered occupying the situation of usher in a school at Lynn in Norfolk. He was immediately apprehended and conveyed in custody to York Castle, and on the 13th of August 1759 he was brought to trial at the assizes before Mr. Justice Noel. The testimony of Houseman to the facts which we have described, and of the other witnesses whose evidence was of a corroborative character, was then adduced, and from the proof which was given it appeared that the share of plunder derived by the prisoner did not exceed £150. Aram's defence was both ingenious and able, and would not have disgraced any of the best lawyers of the day. It is a curious and interesting address, and we subjoin it, as affording the best criterion of the talents of the prisoner which can well be adduced. He thus addressed the court: "My Lord, I know not whether it is of right or through some indulgence of your lordship that I am allowed the liberty at this bar, and at this time, to attempt a defence, incapable and uninstructed as I am to speak; since, while I see so many eyes upon me, so numerous and awful a concourse fixed with attention and filled with I know not what expectancy, I labour not with guilt, my lord, but with perplexity; for having never seen a court but this, being wholly unacquainted with law, the customs of the bar, and all judiciary proceedings, I fear I shall be so little capable of speaking with propriety in this place, that it exceeds my hope if I shall be able to speak at all. I have heard, my lord, the indictment read, wherein I find myself charged with the highest crime, with an enormity I am altogether incapable of, a fact to the commission of which there goes far more insensibility of heart, more profligacy of morals, than ever fell to my lot, and nothing possibly could have admitted a presumption of this nature but a depravity not inferior to that imputed to me. However, as I stand indicted at your lordship's bar, and have heard what is called evidence adduced in support of such a charge, I very humbly solicit your lordship's patience, and beg the hearing of this respectable audience, while I, single and unskilful, destitute of friends, and unassisted by counsel, say something, perhaps like argument, in my defence. I shall consume but little of your lordship's time. What I have to say will be short, and this brevity, probably, will be the best part of it. However, it is offered with all possible regard and the greatest submission to your lordship's consideration and that of this honourable court. First, my lord, the whole tenor of my conduct in life contradicts every particular of the indictment. Yet had I never said this, did not my present circumstances extort it from me, and seem to make it necessary. Permit me here, my lord, to call upon malignity itself, so long and cruelly busied in this prosecution, to charge upon me any immorality of which prejudice was not the author. No, my lord, I concerted no schemes of fraud, projected no violence, injured no man's person or property. My days were honestly laborious, my nights intensely studious, and I humbly conceive my notice of this, especially at this time, will not be thought impertinent or unseasonable, but at least deserving some attention, because, my lord, that any person, after a temperate use of life, a series of thinking and acting regularly, and without one single deviation from sobriety, should plunge into the very depth of profligacy precipitately and at once, is altogether improbable and unprecedented, and absolutely inconsistent with the course of things. Mankind is never corrupted at once. Villainy is always progressive, and declines from right, step by step, till every regard of probity is lost, and every sense of all moral obligation totally perishes. Again, my lord, a suspicion of this kind, which nothing but malevolence could entertain and ignorance propagate, is violently opposed by my very situation at that time with respect to health, for, but a little space before, I had been confined to my bed, and suffered under a very long and severe disorder, and was not able for half a year together so much as to walk. The distemper left me indeed, yet slowly, and in part, but so macerated, so enfeebled, that I was reduced to crutches, and so far from being well about the time I am charged with this fact, I have never, to this day, perfectly recovered. Could then a person in this condition take anything into his head so unlikely, so extravagant? I, past the vigour of my age, feeble and valetudinary, with no inducement to engage, no ability to accomplish, no weapon wherewith to perpetrate such a deed, without interest, without power, without motive, without means. Besides, it must needs occur to every one that an action of this atrocious nature is never heard of but when its springs are laid open. It appears that it was to support some indolence, or supply some luxury, to satisfy some avarice, or oblige some malice, to prevent some real or imaginary want. Yet I lay not under the influence of these. Surely, my lord, I may consistently with both truth and modesty affirm thus much, and none who have any veracity and knew me will ever question this. In the second place, the disappearance of Clark is suggested as an argument of his being dead, but the uncertainty of such an inference from that, and the fallibility of all conclusions of such a sort from such a circumstance, are too obvious and too notorious to require instances, yet superseding many, permit me to produce a very recent one, and that afforded by this castle. In June 1757, William Thompson, for all the vigilance of this place, in open daylight and double ironed, made his escape, and notwithstanding an immediate inquiry set on foot, the strictest search, and all advertisement, was never heard of since. If, then, Thompson got off unseen through all these difficulties, how very easy it was for Clark, when none of them opposed him. But what would be thought of a prosecution commenced against any one seen last with Thompson? Permit me, my lord, to observe a little upon the bones which have been discovered. It is said, which perhaps is saying very far, that these are the skeleton of a man. It is possible, indeed, it may, but is there any certain known criterion which incontestably distinguishes the sex in human bones? Let it be considered, my lord, whether the ascertaining of this point ought not to precede any attempt to identify them. The place of their depositum, too, claims much more attention than is commonly bestowed upon it, for of all the places in the world none could have mentioned any one wherein there was greater certainty of finding human bones than a hermitage, except he should point out a churchyard. Hermitages, in time past, being not only places of religious retirement, but of burial too, and it has scarce or never been heard of, but that every cell now known contains or contained these relics of humanity, some mutilated and some entire. I do not inform, but give me leave to remind your lordship, that here sat solitary sanctity, and here the hermit or the anchoress hoped that repose for their bones when dead they here enjoyed when living. All the while, my lord, I am sensible that this is known to your lordship, and many in this court, better than to me, but it seems necessary to my case that others, who have not at all, perhaps, adverted to things of this nature, and may have concern in my trial, should be made acquainted with it. Suffer me then, my lord, to produce a few of many evidences that these cells were used as repositories of the dead, and to enumerate a few in which human bones have been found, as it happened in this question, lest to some that the accident might seem extraordinary, and consequently occasion prejudice. 1. The bones, as was supposed, of the Saxon saint Dubritius, were discovered buried in his cell at Guy's Cliff, near Warwick, as appears from the authority of Sir William Dugdale. 2. The bones, thought to be those of the anchoress Rosia, were but lately discovered in a cell at Royston, entire, fair, and undecayed, though they must have lain interred for several centuries, as is proved by Dr. Stukely. 3. But my own country, nay, almost this neighbourhood, supplies another instance, for in January 1747 were found by Mr. Stovin, accompanied by a reverend gentleman, the bones in part of some recluse in the cell at Lindholm, near Hatfield. They were believed to be those of William of Lindholm, a hermit, who had long made this cave his habitation. 4. In February 1744, part of Woburn Abbey being pulled down, a large portion of corpse appeared, even with the flesh on, and which bore cutting with a knife, though it is certain that this had lain above 200 years, and how much longer is doubtful, for this abbey was founded in 1145, and dissolved in 1538 or 1539. What would have been said, what believed, if this had been an accident to the bones in question? Farther, my lord, it is not yet out of living memory, that at a little distance from Knaresborough, in a field, part of the manor of the worthy and patriot baronet, who does that borough the honour to represent it in Parliament, were found, in digging for gravel, not one human skeleton only, but 5 or 6, deposited side by side, with each an urn placed under its head, as your lordship knows was usual in ancient interments. About the same time, and in another field almost close to this borough, was discovered also, in searching for gravel, another human skeleton, but the piety of the same worthy gentleman ordered both pits to be filled up again, commendably unwilling to disturb the dead. Is the invention of these bones forgotten then, or industriously concealed, that the discovery of those in question may appear more singular and extraordinary, whereas in fact there is nothing extraordinary in it? My lord, almost every place conceals such remains. In fields, in hills, in highway sides, in commons, lie frequent and unsuspected bones, and our present allotments for rest for the departed are but of some centuries. Another particular seems not to claim a little of your lordship's notice, and that of the gentlemen of the jury, which is that perhaps no example occurs of more than one skeleton being found in one cell, and in the cell in question was found but one, agreeable in this to the peculiarity of every other known cell in Britain. Not the invention of one skeleton, but of 2, would have appeared suspicious and uncommon, but it seems another skeleton has been discovered by some labourer, which was full as confidently averred to be Clark's as this. My lord, must some of the living, if it promotes some interest, be made answerable for all the bones that earth has concealed and chance exposed? And might not a place where bones lay be mentioned by a person by chance, as well as found by a labourer by chance? Or is it more criminal accidentally to name where bones lie than accidentally to find where they lie? Here too is a human skull produced, which is fractured. But was this the cause, or was it the consequence of death? Was it owing to violence, or was it the effect of natural decay? If it was violence, was that violence before or after death? My lord, in May 1732 the remains of William, Lord Archbishop of this province, were taken up, by permission, in this cathedral, and the bones of the skull were found broken, yet certainly he died by no violence offered to him alive that could occasion the fracture there. Let it be considered, my lord, that upon the dissolution of religious houses and the commencement of the Reformation, the ravages of those times affected both the living and the dead. In search after imaginary treasures, coffins were broken up, graves and vaults dug open, monuments ransacked, and shrines demolished, and it ceased about the beginning of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. I entreat your lordship, suffer not the violence, the depredations, and the iniquities of those times to be imputed to this. Moreover, what gentleman here is ignorant that Knaresborough had a castle, which, though now a ruin, was once considerable both for its strength and garrison? All know it was vigorously besieged by the arms of the Parliament, at which siege, in sallies, conflicts, fights, pursuits, many fell in all the places round it, and where they fell were buried. For every place, my lord, is burial earth in war, and many, questionless of these, rest yet unknown, whose bones futurity shall discover. I hope, with all imaginable submission, that what has been said will not be thought impertinent to this indictment, and that it will be far from the wisdom, the learning, and the integrity of this place to impute to the living what zeal in its fury may have done, what nature may have taken off, and piety interred, or what war alone may have destroyed, alone deposited. As to the circumstances that have been raked together, I have nothing to observe but that all circumstances whatever are precarious, and have been but too frequently found lamentably fallible. Even the strongest have failed. They may rise to the utmost degree of probability, yet they are but probability still. Why need I name to your lordship the two Harrisons recorded by Dr. Howell, who both suffered upon circumstances because of the sudden disappearance of their lodger, who was in credit, had contracted debts, borrowed money, and went off unseen, and returned a great many years after their execution? Why name the intricate affair of Jacques de Moulin under King Charles II, related by a gentleman who was counsel for the crown? And why the unhappy Coleman, who suffered innocently, though convicted upon positive evidence, and whose children perished for want, because the world uncharitably believed the father guilty? Why mention the perjury of Smith, incautiously admitted King's evidence, who, to screen himself, equally accused Fairclough and Loveday of the murder of Dunn, the first of whom in 1749 was executed at Winchester, and Loveday was about to suffer at Reading, had not Smith been proved perjured to the satisfaction of the court by the governor of Gosport Hospital. Now, my lord, having endeavoured to show that the whole of this process is altogether repugnant to every part of my life, that it is inconsistent with my condition of health about that time, that no rational inference can be drawn that a person is dead who suddenly disappears, that hermitages are the constant depositories of the bones of a recluse, that the proofs of this are well authenticated, that the revolutions in religion or the fortunes of war have mangled or buried the dead, the conclusion remains, perhaps, no less reasonable than impatiently wished for. I, at last, after a year's confinement, equal to either fortune, put myself upon the justice, the candour, and the humanity of your lordship, and upon yours, my countrymen, gentlemen of the jury. The delivery of this address created a very considerable impression in court, but the learned judge having calmly, and with great perspicuity, summed up the evidence which had been produced, and having observed upon the prisoner's defence, which he declared to be one of the most ingenious pieces of reasoning that had ever fallen under his notice, the jury, with a little hesitation, returned a verdict of guilty. Sentence of death was then passed upon the prisoner, who received the intimation of his fate with becoming resignation. After his conviction he confessed the justice of his sentence to two clergymen who were directed to attend him, a sufficient proof of the fruitlessness of the efforts to prove him innocent, which the morbid sentimentality of late writers has induced them to attempt. Upon an inquiry being made of him as to his reason for committing the crime, he declared that he had reason to suspect Clarke of having had unlawful intercourse with his wife, and that at the time of his committing the murder he had thought that he was acting rightly, but that he had since thought that his crime could not be justified or excused. In the hopes of avoiding the ignominious death which he was doomed to suffer, on the night before his execution he attempted to commit suicide by cutting his arm in 2 places with a razor which he had concealed for that purpose. This attempt was not discovered until the morning, when the gaoler came to lead him forth to the place of execution, and he was then found almost expiring from loss of blood. A surgeon was immediately sent for, who found that he had wounded himself severely on the left arm, above the elbow and near the wrist, but he had missed the artery, and his life was prolonged only in order that it might be taken away on the scaffold. When he was placed on the drop, he was perfectly sensible, but was too weak to be able to join in devotion with the clergyman who attended him. He was executed at York on the 16th of August 1759, and his body was afterwards hung in chains in Knaresborough Forest. The following papers were afterwards found in his handwriting on the table in his cell. The first contained reasons for his attempt upon his life, and was as follows: "What am I better than my fathers? To die is natural and is necessary. Perfectly sensible of this, I fear no more to die than I did to be born. But the manner of it is something which should, in my opinion, be decent and manly. I think I have regarded both these points. Certainly no man has a better right to dispose of a man's life than himself, and he, not others, should determine how. As for any indignities offered to my body, or silly reflections on my faith and morals, they are, as they always were, things indifferent to me. I think, though contrary to the common way of thinking, I wrong no man by this, and I hope it is not offensive to that eternal being that formed me and the world, and as by this I injure no man can be reasonably offended. I solicitously recommend myself to that eternal and almighty being, the God of nature, if I have done amiss. But perhaps I have not, and I hope this thing will never be imputed to me. Though I am now stained by malevolence and suffer by prejudice, I hope to rise fair and unblemished. My life was not polluted, my morals irreproachable, and my opinions orthodox. I slept sound till 3 o'clock, awakened, and then writ these lines: Come, pleasing rest, eternal slumbers fall, seal mine, that once must seal the eyes of all. Calm and composed my soul her journey takes, no guilt that troubles and no heart that aches. Adieu, thou sun, all bright, like her arise. Adieu, fair friends, and all that's good and wise. The second was in the form of a letter addressed to a former companion, and was in the following terms: My dear friend, before this reaches you, I shall be no more a living man in this world, though at present in perfect bodily health. But who can describe the horrors of mind which I suffer at this instant? Guilt. The guilt of blood shed without any provocation, without any cause but that of filthy lucre, pierces my conscience with wounds that give the most poignant pains. 'Tis true, the consciousness of my horrid guilt has given me frequent interruptions in the midst of my business or pleasures, but yet I have found means to stifle its clamours, and contrived a momentary remedy for the disturbance it gave me, by applying to the bottle, or the bowl, or diversions, or company, or business, sometimes one, and sometimes the other, as opportunity offered. But now all these, and all other amusements, are at an end, and I am left forlorn, helpless, and destitute of every comfort, for I have nothing now in view but the certain destruction both of my soul and body. My conscience will now no longer suffer itself to be hoodwinked or browbeat. It has now got the mastery. It is my accuser, judge, and executioner, and the sentence it pronounceth against me is more dreadful than that I heard from the bench, which only condemned my body to the pains of death, which are soon over, but conscience tells me plainly that she will summon me before another tribunal, where I shall have neither power nor means to stifle the evidence she will there bring against me, and that the sentence which will then be denounced will not only be irreversible, but will condemn my soul to torments that will know no end. Oh, had I but hearkened to the advice which dear bought experience has enabled me to give, I should not now have been plunged into that dreadful gulf of despair which I find it impossible to extricate myself from, and therefore my soul is filled with horror inconceivable. I see both God and man my enemies, and in a few hours shall be exposed a public spectacle for the world to gaze at. Can you conceive any condition more horrible than mine? Oh no, it cannot be. I am determined therefore to put a short end to trouble, I am no longer able to bear, and prevent the executioner by doing his business with my own hand, and shall by this means at least prevent the shame and disgrace of a public exposure, and leave the care of my soul in the hands of eternal mercy. Wishing you all health, happiness, and prosperity, I am to the last moment of my life yours, with the sincerest regard, Eugene Aram. It is impossible to view the circumstances of this remarkable case without being struck with the extraordinary conduct of Aram. It is most singular that a man of his talents and mind should have leagued himself with a person like Houseman, who appears to have been utterly uneducated, in the commission of a murder, and with the hope only of gain, or whatever his declarations after his conviction may have been, as to his object being revenge only for the supposed injury which had been done him by his victim in the seduction of his wife, his ready acquiescence of the plot with another, and his willing acceptance of the plunder which was obtained, distinctly show that that was not the only end which he sought to attain. If indeed his feelings were outraged, as he suggested, he would have selected some other mode of obtaining that satisfaction to which the injury alleged would have entitled him, and it is hardly to be supposed that he would have obtained the assistance of another to secure the object which he had in view, more particularly when it appears that it was he who absolutely committed the foul act, without the immediate aid of Houseman, a circumstance which clearly exemplifies the power which he possessed to dispose of his victim, and which would seem to show a desire on his part only to obtain the participation of another in a preconceived act, anticipating doubtless that some aid would be necessary in appropriating and disposing of the property which might be procured from the deceased, and also that some advice would be requisite in the event of suspicion attaching to him. But while these circumstances cannot but surprise us, how much more astonishing is the divine power of Providence, which disclosed to human eyes, after so long a lapse of time, such evidence as in the result proved the commissions of the crime, and which secured the seizure of the criminal, who had up to that time remained unsuspected, and who even then was living in fancied security, free from all fear of discovery and apprehension. It is said that murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. And how truly is this observation of the most wonderful of poets exemplified by nearly every page of these records of crime. End of part 24.